Thank you very much, Randy. Let's go right back to our phone callers. Next up is Keith in Bakersfield, California. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Hank. In reference to, I've heard you spoke before and also in your book about how dispensationalists skip a temple with Old Testament prophecy. I believe it was in Ezekiel or Zechariah or Jeremiah. How they skip a temple and refer to either a third or fourth temple. What scripture exactly are they alluding to?
Well, what I'm saying is that you have to understand that Ezekiel is writing from a refugee camp in the south of Babylon near the �𝘉𝘯 River. And he's there looking with great longing to a future temple that is going to be built. That future temple is the second temple. It's not a third or a fourth temple.
Right.
And what the dispensationalist wants to say is that between Matthew chapter 24, verse 2 and Matthew 24, verse 4, Jesus suddenly stops talking about the second temple and suddenly starts talking about a third temple. Well, that simply makes no sense whatsoever because Jesus is answering a question that the disciples are asking him. I mean, Matthew 24 is a continuation of what happened in Matthew 23. Jesus pronounces Ichabod on the temple. And then, while he's walking through the splendor of the temple and its courts, the disciples draw his attention to its buildings, and they're saying, look at the beauty of this temple and its surroundings. You telling me that this is going to be destroyed? And Jesus says, absolutely. And then later on, while they're on the Mount of Olives, they ask Jesus privately, when is this temple going to be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming in judgment and the end of this age of sacrifice? When's this going to happen? And then Jesus gives them all the signs and then tells them specifically that it will happen within a generation. This generation will not pass away until all these things have been fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away. So Jesus puts an exclamation point there. He says it's going to happen within a generation. Now, skeptics and infidels have pointed to this and said there's no way out. Jesus Christ is a false prophet because he thought he was going to come within a generation and he didn't. Well, what they are doing is making the same mistake as the dispensationalists making. They are not reading the text in the sense in which it's intended. When Jesus says this generation, he means this generation. But when he's talking about sun, moon, and stars, he's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the judgment that will befall Jerusalem using language familiar to anyone who's read through the Bible. And unfortunately, I find that all too often people haven't read through the Bible and they're arguing about these things. Or they haven't read Revelation chapter 6 where the Lamb opens the sixth seal and suddenly there's a great earthquake in heaven and then the sun turns black like sackcloth made out of goat hair and the moon turns blood red and the stars fall from the skies. And so again, John is using the same language that Isaiah uses in the same way that Jesus used the language that Isaiah uses. He's talking about destruction that is going to befall Jerusalem within a generation. And that prophecy is fulfilled just as Jesus predicted. Within a generation, Titus and the Roman armies destroy the temple, an unthinkable feat, just as Jesus had pronounced they would. So he's proved once again to be a true prophet, not a false prophet.
Right. Very good. Thank you, Hank. Appreciate your ministry, brother, and thank you for being obedient.
God bless you, my friend. Thank you for your call. Yeah, apart from historical context, we would be hard-pressed to understand the prophecies of Ezekiel. Again, we have to be mindful of the fact that Ezekiel was prophesying from dusty environs. He was in a refugee camp. He was in the south of Babylon, and from there he looks into the eastern sky and he longs for the glory of the Lord to return to a temple that had vanished into the rocks that once surrounded it. He yearned for the promise of a temple whose glory would exceed even the glory of Solomon's temple. And so in the Spirit, he looks forward to events that would take place a generation later, a time when Zerubbabel would rebuild the glorious temple, a time when Ezra would rebuild the spiritual condition of the exiles, a time in which Nehemiah would challenge his fellow countrymen to arise and rebuild the shattered wall of Jerusalem. The point is simply this: we must not presume that Ezekiel longed for a third or even a fourth temple when a second temple had not as yet arisen from the ashes. And therefore, we should not presume that Ezekiel looks into the 21st century and there sees the emergence of a temple on the very spot where the Dome of the Rock now stands. Remember this principle: the magnifying glass through which we read the law and the prophets must ever remain in the hands of the New Testament writers. They do the interpretive work for us, and therefore we should not be fooled by modern-day interpreters. We have a certain interpretation, and to suppose that Shekinah glory will return to a shrine in Jerusalem in the present epoch is to regress from substance to shadow. It is to impugn the finished work of Jesus Christ. It's paradise. It's a new heaven and a new earth, not Palestine, for which Ezekiel ultimately yearned. It's the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband, upon which he fixed his apocalyptic gaze. And it's the master teacher, not a majestic temple, that would forever satisfy the deepest yearnings of a prophet exiled in a dry and thirsty land. All of this has to do with learning to read the Bible for all it's worth. It's one of the reasons I wrote, Has God Spoken? And this is memorable proof of the Bible's divine inspiration. When you get done reading this book, you know that you know that you know that what you have given your life to is not a phantom dream. It is absolute reality. You can stake your life on what is written, divinely etched in its pages.